What are tankies and why are they like that? So, from what I understand, as recovering liberal, someone who's becoming more engaged and interested in actual, leftist concepts, from what I understand, the term tanky is a somewhat pejorative term used to describe people who are generally sympathetic to various communist regimes. I think specifically the more authoritarian, or some would argue oppressive, aspects of those regimes. Now, I have heard, some people who some would call tankies say that those aspects are not authoritarian or attempt to explain them or justify them in different ways. I think others would argue that that level of authoritarianism is necessary to establish the form of communism that they're trying to establish. But the truth is, I don't really know. So hopefully Hakim will set the record straight. Let's take a look.
Tanky is a term you hear thrown around a lot, but it seemingly doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah, so the tanks are like, referring to like we're, going to roll tanks through your city as a show of strength and oppression and authoritarianism, basically. I think it may refer to a specific event that happened, but I'm not really sure. So let's take a look.
The quick summary is, it doesn't really. Well, it kinda does, but the intention behind its use is generally nebulous, and the term is expanded so much as to be meaningless.
Look at that editing, yo.
The origins of the term. Originally,
Okay, here we
tanky
go.
was a term that originated in the British left wing for those that supported the Soviet intervention in Hungary. The
Okay.
intervention is a huge topic
Yeah.
in and of itself, so take a look at the history of the working class movement in Hungary for a deeper dive. TLDR, it's far more complicated than libertarian socialist uprising or complete fascist takeover. Regardless, neither that Hungarian Republic nor the USSR are with us today, so why is the term still used? What people mean. Nowadays, the term tanky is mostly used by people, some of which claiming to be leftist, while others clearly not, to...
Oh, God. What was that last tweet?
Nowadays, the term tanky is mostly used by people, some of which claim...
Hate leftists, but I am leftists. This guy's a tanky. He doesn't care for human rights. Yeah, so that's the thing with tankies. Stereotypically, they generally seem to, I I think this is probably a mischaracterization. They would not say, generally speaking, I don't think tankies, self-described tankies, stereotypically described tankies would say we're against human rights. I don't think they would say that. But everyone and their grandmother has opinions on, like, different opinions on, how much freedom we should have. Things like freedom of speech. There are no free speech absolutists. Those don't exist. Those are more mythological than actual unicorns. Everyone is in favor of some level of speech, suppression, in order to maintain order, maintain society. Everyone is for that. The question is how much. Obviously, places like, China restrict things like the press, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, a lot more than I would say liberal democracies do. At least that's the stereotypical perception that I think most people, have. I'm sure, leftists, communists, tankies would say otherwise. I'm just saying that's the stereotypical impression. And so for myself, I'm generally, I would say, pro those types of civil liberties. I would not say I'm a free speech absolutist, but I'm generally for, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, things like that. I think that those are, generally speaking, positive things. Now, I do believe in laws and regulations over certain things, but compared to, some of the rhetoric I see from some on the left, if you want to use that shitty political compass, people on the, authoritarian left quadrant, that I don't personally agree with. Now, I'm still learning about a lot of things, obviously. I'm not going to say I have the perfect opinion on everything, far from it. But that's kind of where I am today. On that shitty thing, I'm in the bottom left quadrant, like almost in the corner. I took the test in one of my very first videos on this channel, so you could take a look at that if you want to see my results. But I'm definitely more libertarian left, like in terms of civil liberties. I'm generally for being pretty open with civil liberties. And at least perception wise, Tankies, the authoritarian left, tend to be less, open toward those freedoms. And I think you see that reflected in certain, left wing governments. And again, feel free to correct the record in the comments. I'm just saying what I've heard, what I've learned. But it seems as though certain communist regimes, like the Soviet Union, like China today, tend to be pretty repressive when it comes to civil liberties. And so I've heard various justifications. Some people say it's not actually like that. Some people say it is like that. But here are the reasons. And so I feel like I'm rambling. Let's just keep watching.
To be leftist, while others clearly not, to refer derogatorily to... Well, here's where it gets a little more complicated. There are a few targets. Number 1, in the narrowest possible definition, Tankies are those that are more or less partial to the experiences and lessons of former socialist as well as current socialist examples, as well as their leaders, for example the USSR, Cuba, Vietnam, etc.
Okay, so in this definition, it seems it's just anyone who's generally sympathetic to past or present communist regimes. Like I said, the term, the way I've heard it more usually defined, tends to be more that they're accepting of the more authoritarian, culturally suppressive, aspects of those regimes. And again, correct the record if I'm wrong. I'm sure Hakim is going to explain this a lot better than I am. I'm just saying, prior to learning about this from this video, what I know it to be. I'm more than willing to say I'm wrong. Obviously, hopefully by the end of this video, I'll have a more multifaceted understanding of what this is all about.
Number 2, slightly broader, a tankie is anyone who defends, or more commonly simply clarifies misconceptions around former socialisms. A tankie also usually presents a nuanced understanding of why certain actions were taken, which some interpret as running defense for something supposedly inexcusable. Number 3, broader still, as a catch-all term for Marxist-Leninists and adjacent ideologies, which usually...
Yeah, I have heard it used in that way as well. Generally from, people who really don't know what they're talking about, like conservatives, many liberals, will just refer to anyone, left of Bernie Sanders as a tankie, which I don't think is an accurate term.
Encapsulate support for the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic centralism, the active suppression of the bourgeoisie, a more involved approach towards internal security, economic planning, etc. This also usually follows the condemnation of the use of force in times when it was possible that it was warranted. This links well with the general link with authoritarianism, which we'll touch on soon. Anti-imperialism, and by extension anti-Americanism too, fits here, so I'll mention it. Number 4, much more commonly, tankie is a lazy term used to demonize people to the left of the one using the term. Generally intended...
Yeah, okay, that's kind of what I was saying a second ago. My followers think you're a stupid fucking tanky moron. Hope that helps.
To dismiss and ostracize said people without engaging or offering a counter-argument. This particular usage case is most common with liberals who adopt...
Yep, like I said, I have heard it a lot from liberals, for sure.
A radical lib approach, without any theoretically derived radical content, besides engagement in electoral politics and an allegiance to American exceptionalism. A derived term, although even more nebulous, is red fascist, usually just shortened to red fash, but we're not going to touch on that today. And number 5.
That's something I've seen more recently. I hadn't seen that much up until recently, this red fash thing. I'd be curious to learn more about that as well.
Finally, the caricature. A person that doesn't exist with opinions that no one really holds, but it's used for soy Wojak memes, as the internet usually does. It's supposed to mean someone who uncritically supports everything a socialist nation does. These people don't exist. The USSR or China or Stalin did nothing wrong is a meme set online as a joke. No one actually believes it.
Yeah, Hakim's correct here in that those people don't exist. I would say, maybe not the most accurate characterization on his part. I would say, and maybe this is the lib in me blossoming out, I would say that these are people who are more willing to defend certain things that, I guess he kind of touched on this already, that other people would call indefensible. The more authoritarian aspects to their regimes. Defending those things that other people would say have no, reasonable grounds to be defended. And so I think that's closer to what most people say when they refer to, slightly more charitable people referring to Tankies than the really crazy people referring to Tankies. But anyway.
Likewise, seeing someone saying something on Twitter and interpreting that opinion as representative of the entire movement is silly. In my personal experience, you won't ever see a more critical and nuanced view of, for example, the USSR than from someone who has actually taken the effort to properly study that system, usually a well-read Marxist-Leninist.
The spine was spine-checked by real spine-checking patriots.
We have a dedicated episode on that topic here. What's the point? More or less, it's a commonality of politics to invent derogatory terms for those that you disagree with. This example is no different. In almost all use cases I've seen, it's used exclusively online by mostly rad-libs and other quasi-liberal types to dismiss an argument or person without engaging with the...
I mean, conservatives use it a lot too. I mean, leftists might say there's not a lot of difference between liberals and conservatives, and I think there's certain merits to that, especially economically speaking. But I have heard conservatives use that term derogatorily to, again, anyone left of like Bernie Sanders, or like even, to the right of Bernie Sanders, but to like the left of the modern Republican movement. But anyway.
Content itself. I remember anarchists, ANCOMs, and the like using it plenty before, but that usage has died down over the past several years, from what I've seen. Regardless, a good point to note is that if we're using the term against people who recognize the achievements of former socialisms and adhere to more or less orthodox theoretical approaches to socialism, meaning Marxist-Leninist ones, then this term is a little more than, hopefully, an unintentional condemnation of third world or imperial periphery leftists. The vast majority, dare I say all actually influential Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, fit the tanky label if applied uniformly. Even more so when looking at post-independence, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist, read Black and Brown, figures. The vast majority of active leftists globally, the ones agitating for socialism, are people who identify with Marxism-Leninism or an adjacent offshoot, who recognize and respect the lessons of...
Well, hey, here's the thing, again, at least in my experience, maybe hanging out in more, at this point, more progressive and left-wing circles, not quite like liberal circles, but I definitely do, I go on Reddit a lot, so I do hang out in certain liberal circles. In my anecdotal experience, and I always harp about anecdotes and how they're shitty, so don't take this as more than an anecdote, but at least in the circles I hang out in, they're not using tanky to refer to, all Marxist-Leninists, all people who are in favor of socialisms or communism in general, as tankies. Specifically, what I see it, more commonly referring to is those more authoritarian, those more, suppressive elements to certain governments that have called themselves socialist or communist. And I did think he said he'd touch on that later. And I'm not trying to say what he's saying is wrong, but it is a little different, at least in the circles that I hang out in, the leftist people I follow, that it is a little different than this characterization, but I'm sure what he's describing exists as well. At least, I guess, again, we're talking about me here. My issues with these, socialist or communist regimes tend to be mostly in regard to the suppressive and authoritarian elements to them that I perceive to be suppressive and authoritarian. Feel free to set the record straight in the comments. I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to learn all day long. That's what this project is for me. There's a lot of things that the more I'm learning about socialism, leftist ideology in general, that I 100% agree with. It's more, the how we get there that I don't agree with. Like, for instance, a lot of the left is revolutionary. I'm more of an incrementalist when it comes to, getting to the next stage of our socioeconomic system. And so, I guess my point is I sympathize and empathize a lot with these leftist concepts, but what I interpret to be these more suppressive and authoritarian, concepts, I don't personally agree with them. And that's what I would say, what I've seen most people use the term tanky to refer to, I guess, is my ultimate point of this little mini ramble. But again, for the love of God, if I am mischaracterizing something, Please let me know in the comments.
The former socialist experiments are usually part of Marxist-Leninist parties and uphold figures that symbolize the revolutionary socialist movement. In essence, the vast majority of the global left would be tanky in that case. What does that say about the so-called non-tanky Western left, though? Isn't it at least a little infantilizing and Eurocentric to consider that only the West has it right, meanwhile the vast majority of historic as well as modern revolutionary leftists had it entirely wrong? Likewise, the term seems to apply selectively.
I would have liked it right here if he kind of, and maybe this is something that like is implicit to most of his audience, but I would have liked it if he explained a little bit more about the difference between what he just described as like Western or like European leftism, and the other forms of leftism that we've seen, because I don't know too much about it. He other than like the few visuals he flashed, like democratic socialism, democratic socialism, I think falls in that like lib left quadrant, right? Like that's not the tanky quadrant, right? And so I guess we'll see if he expands on that, later on.
Those with incredibly similar beliefs and approaches may get the label on them, or not usually based on the level of demonization in common anti-communist American media, or based on how much that particular individual likes said figure. Concretely, Sankara and Castro aren't too different from Kim Il-sung or Honecker. On authority. Another point usually tied into tanky discourse is the idea of authority or authoritarianism.
Okay, this is probably closer to what I see tankies as, or what I usually see the term being used to refer to.
Before getting into it, the term is also incredibly nebulous. Between dictionaries and various quote-unquote respectable encyclopedias, you get several incredibly broad or contradictory definitions. As with totalitarianism, it's more of an invented political term, used in attempts by, particularly American academia, to lump fascism with socialism. This is further strengthened by the fact that the same
Yeah, that's the like horseshoe theory. I think I'm seeing more people talk about how like, you start at like the far left and then you, how does my camera work? You start at the far left and then you go to, less far left, center, liberal, whatever, conservative, far right, and suddenly you're in the same position again in terms of like policy and like actions and like how they do things. And so I think that's kind of that must be what that red fash is that he was talking about too. Again, I don't know too much about that. I'd be curious to hear more about that perspective. I don't think it's one I personally agree with, but I'd be curious to learn more about that for sure. Maybe he's going to talk about it more here. Let's take a look.
Yardstick can parallel, for example, the US very well, or even better than the intended nation that label is being placed upon, yet it's rarely done. Typical government versus regime language in an attempt to more subtly shape what you think. For the liberals in the crowd, name something you dislike about authoritarian socialist governments.
Okay, so I think most leftists would still call me a liberal, even though like in terms of like outcome, I think we agree with. There's a lot more that we agree with than we disagree. Like I 100% think the government should provide you with the basic means to live, free of charge, like housing, food, healthcare, education, all those things should be free. It's more, like I said, I think how we get there that I think, certain people on the left disagree with. The tanky faction, the democratic socialist faction that I think I more closely associate myself with. But anyway, what was his question?
For the liberals in the crowd, name something you dislike about authoritarian socialist governments.
Name something I dislike about authoritarian socialist governments. I think I kind of did earlier, and again, like, that's just like, you have to understand, all of my education up until I started this project for the most part, and I started watching people like Hassan, has been through a Western liberal lens. And so, with that in mind, viewer of this video, I would say, with my notably biased opinion, and probably I'm willing to say I might be mischaracterizing, I would say, and I, like I said earlier, my issue with these, quote, authoritarian socialist regimes tend to be, restriction of personal freedoms. I do believe in freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, things like that. And that's, and again, I don't want to say, to make it sound like, I'm also saying by extension, ipso facto, that like America is perfect in terms of what I want in regard to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, etc. It's not. I'm not trying to say like, we're, infinitely better than these regimes or whatever. I'm more than willing to criticize the United States all fucking day long. But yeah, if you were to ask me what I dislike about these regimes, it's that for the most part.
Any government model you look up to or believe is viable to reform has most likely done the same at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, like I'm not trying to say like America, is like perfect at that. And then that we don't do a whole lot to suppress free speech, freedom of expression, etc. On top of all the other fucked up things we do. I'm not saying China bad, America good. I hope viewers of this understand that. I'm not trying to say that. But I am generally for civil liberties. And so and those are places where I think a lot of these communist or socialist regimes do fall short in a lot of ways. But again, feel free to correct the record. I'm willing to listen.
To differing extents. I would actually say the prime liberal democratic example, the United States, has done far worse on almost every account, but they're always spared the term or the criticism.
Yeah, in like different ways, yes. Like, America bad, China bad. Let's say those things are true. I would say in different ways. And so the things he's describing, that America does that's bad, that undermines those things, we kind of do it in different ways. When I say these things, don't think I'm saying America is good or great. But generally speaking, like I can say fuck Joe Biden and not get thrown in jail. Like I think that's a good thing. With that said, and I think he's going to get into this, there are arguments as to, and I'm probably mischaracterizing something, but like arguments as to why those countries are doing that at like the stage of socialism they claim to be in. Maybe they would argue that eventually, we would move away from those more authoritarian things. Those are all things that I've heard. Maybe he'll get into that. But yeah, like I do think we have a freer press than a lot of the like Soviet Union or, current China. I do think we have more unrestricted freedom of expression, generally speaking. And I think those are good things. And don't take that as me saying China is literally Hitler. Please don't. They have trains. That's great. There's a lot of good things to appreciate, potentially, about the way they, handle their socioeconomic system. But for me specifically, it does come down to those civil liberties that I do truly believe in. And democracy, too. I do believe in democracy, which is why I think I most closely associate with like democratic socialism right now. And to me, to a lot of like human rights organizations that I admit are probably looking at it from a Western liberal lens, it does seem as though democracy is an issue in a lot of these, socialist attempts at socialism. I don't think that is any sort of inevitability of socialism or communism. I do think you can have a socialist system that isn't authoritarian, that does preserve civil liberties. And that's what I would advocate for. But again, I can't emphasize how much I am just talking out of my ass because I'm still in the learning process. I'm just giving my current opinion. I'm not telling you what you need to think. I'm not saying what I'm saying is correct. Please do your own research, but that's kind of where I stand.
A fairly decent read I'd recommend on this topic is Human Rights in the Soviet Union by...
Okay, Human Rights in the Soviet Union, including comparisons with the USA. So if you're watching this seems like it'd be a good source to do your own research, as I just said.
Albert Szymanski. Likewise, to anarchist listeners, every prior example anarchists uphold had exclusive access to and use of arms, had labor discipline, an internal security apparatus, a system of prisons which included political prisoners, a hierarchical bureaucracy, exclusive control of sources of media, conscription, I could go on. It seems the only successful socialist attempts at building something tangible gets this authoritarian label thrown on it, likewise with this tanky business. The anarchist examples were commendable, but in the end failed fairly early on and in a way that spares them that criticism. My point is, the methods before, during, and after a revolution will always be categorized according to authoritarian means, and hence pretending that revolution, the violent overthrow of one class by another, and the forceful establishment of some form of proletarian rule, be it a state or democratic federated workers' councils, as not authoritarian is just silly. If your issue is less the means and more with the degree of community control, well, this is a question of theory and pragmatism. Any genuine leftist would like nothing more than community control. The thing is, after a revolution, any genuine leftist would like nothing more than community control. After a revolution and a civil war and a reactionary former landlord to fascist movement, foreign sabotage, internal spying, fifth columns, and you end up with a strong centralized state with a highly developed internal security apparatus and more restrictive ideas on certain forms of expression. You can disagree with it, sure, but to claim you don't understand why it happened, or to refuse to recognize why is just silly. We discussed this point to far deeper levels on the podcast episode, so do check it out. The history of the 20th century paints a very clear picture. Socialism is the way forward for the actual majority of humanity. And reform has been proven a failure time and time again.
100%. Can you even see my hand? I am 100% in the reform camp on this question, and I'm sorry if that makes me a lib or something, but that's definitely how I feel.
This leaves us with revolution as the only viable option, which likewise mostly occurred as a result
Disagree.
of a party constituted from the working class with sufficient political will and the support of the people. The work of said party and the mass of the population may, we hope, culminate in revolution and the seizure of state power. This will naturally involve some level of violence, as no ruling class in history has ever peacefully given up their own power. Not only this, but it's also logical to assume, based on the historical image, that once state power is seized, that fledgling nation will require all sorts of new organizations to protect the new gains of the working class, an internal security apparatus, a military of some size, or nuclear weapons, or something similar. Certain levels of oppression against reactionary sections of the population, landlords, former capitalists, fascists, etc. This will take the form of prison or re-education, or possibly even more severe measures if necessary, for example in the case of counter-revolutionary terrorism, as occurred to various extents throughout socialist history. In the messy post-revolution...
This is kind of the second or third time in this video that I feel like he's sort of hand-waving a lot of what people argue that these countries did that, were not so great. And maybe this video isn't the appropriate place to have that conversation, the video he made here, but it does feel like he's hand-waving a little bit to me.
Period, it's also logical to expect excesses, although they are undesirable and should be limited to the maximum extent. Does that make all of this right? Maybe not, but you can see why it would be necessary.
Yeah, I'm not 100% disagreeing with him here in the event of revolution. Again, I guess my questions would be, at what point do you relinquish that power and open up to civil liberties again, if ever? Is that even something Tankies or most communists believe in? Please let me know in the comments.
Frederick Engels on Authority, read.
This is all there, by the way, just read it. Okay, I'm gonna read it and we will cut back. So it seems as though he's basically saying that some level of authority is necessary in certain industries like agriculture in order to function efficiently. And I agree. He seems to be arguing against people who want to completely abolish authority. I feel like he's talking to anarchists, which I am not. I am not anti-authority, really, I think. I just think it needs to be more democratic than I think we see in a lot of these, previous attempts at socialism. I'm not an anarchist. I am not a libertarian. But I do believe in a democracy built by, educated, empathetic people capable of high-level critical thinking. I think that is better than, strict authoritarianism.
Anti-Americanism. This is an interesting point, the one of anti-Americanism. More recently, I've seen the label tanky thrown around, especially concerning one's perspective on the US and its place in the world. There are some that claim Tankies uncritically dislike the US to such a point that they'll end up strange bedfellows to groups or nations that they otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't ideologically support. Putting aside the meaningless content of that support, meaning if you're not sending money or guns or specialists or information, what material reality is there to your so-called support? Let's take a deeper look. First and foremost, again, this is an incredibly online phenomenon. Just because some guy on Twitter said something doesn't make it representative of the actual real-life movement. Likewise, just because your local 32-member Communist Party in the Imperial Core has some out-there beliefs doesn't make it representative of a movement that spans millions and the entire globe. This in and of itself should be enough to discount this anti-American tanky connection. However, for those that believe in this connection, there's a strange dismissal of certain geopolitical reality.
I don't believe in this connection. I don't think this really applies to me, but we'll play it out.
And likewise actual anti-imperialist approaches. There are such things as primary and secondary contradictions. Likewise, class struggle above all is cute but falls apart in the complexities of reality, with the perfect example being the existence of the illegal settler colonial military occupation of Palestine. We need to be materialists about this. Having a critically supportive overview of, for example, Gaddafi isn't based in anti-Americanism, but is based in tangible benefits that administration brought to Libya. Being critically supportive of the Syrian government's attempts at piecing the nation back together after being ravaged by US-backed militias of all ideological stripes doesn't emanate from an anti-Americanism, but from a sober understanding that stability under that government is far more likely, especially when the reason for the massive geopolitical disruption in the region wasn't an organic leftist movement to begin with. You can disagree with the reason, sure, but to claim that this, number one, makes you a tanky, and number two, is mostly based in anti-Americanism is incredibly myopic, and shows just
not something I would say, personally.
How little this term means. Secondly, calling whataboutism when someone replies the US is currently doing worse things as we speak is less about ignoring non-American examples.
I guess I said that earlier. I guess I was kind of doing that. Some would say that, like, you know, tankies, communists, whatever, are so, you know, willing to point out all the horrible things that America does, while ignoring or, you know, otherwise justifying, you know, some of the bad things that, you know, countries that claim to be socialists do.
Of things worthy of condemnation, and more a highlighting of the supreme hypocrisy of liberals that have endless criticisms for everything non-American, but never even so much as graze genuine and principled analysis of the US, NATO, or other related entities.
Sure. And I would like to think I'm beginning to move away from that. I will criticize America and Americans until my fucking heart stops. But I will also criticize anyone who claims to be socialist or whatever that is doing things that I don't agree with as well. Like in America, I don't like that our citizenry doesn't have healthcare. I don't like that 20,000 Americans die every fucking year due to lack of healthcare. This makes America a shitty fucking country. I also don't like that in, like, China, you can't say fuck Xi Jinping. You can't draw him as Winnie the fucking Pooh. That is also not a good thing, in my opinion. I do think it's a little reductive, what I see a lot from, you know, people on the left online, where they will disregard things that, you know, admittedly Western liberal, you know, human rights organizations point out with some of these countries, some of these regimes. And to say that they're all just being silly, hysterical liberals, I think is reductive. I think liberals need to be far more open to criticisms of the West, but I would also say that leftists maybe need to be more open to criticisms of the actions of some of these regimes. And if that makes me a hysterical liberal, then so be it. For the love of God, correct the record in the comments. I'm very curious to learn more. But again, that's where I am today.
That doesn't mean you should go, what about blank, each time something is brought up. Actually, the inverse. You should be well-read enough to be able to rightfully criticize the things worthy of criticism, while being able to provide nuance to the rest, which requires nuance.
Yeah, sure. 100% agree with that. I guess some would argue that despite what he just said, a lot of these, you know, people on the left are willing to be significantly more charitable to the negative actions taken by countries that claim to be socialist versus negative actions done by, you know, the West, let's say. And don't, again, for 1 second, hear that as me defending the West. 100% the West engages in unthinkable amounts of horrific shit, human rights abuses, every fucking day, every second. The shirt I am wearing is a direct result of Western human rights abuses. It's fucked up. But I do think we need to also be aware of negative things that some of these, socialist and communist countries engage in. And I guess my ultimate point is I think that from what I see on the left in far left subreddits that I lurk in, I think that some on the left are maybe a little too charitable to some of these actions, and I think that's going to be a controversial statement that might make me lose a handful of the tiny handful of subscribers I have on this channel. I think that's okay. But I hope you're at least willing to engage in conversation first before you leave. Let me know why I'm wrong.
It's a delicate process. That's why whataboutism doesn't happen between principled and educated Marxists, even on contentious issues within the left. The importance of our past in light of our future. An important side note is to always study our history and learn from it. Dismissing it is either lazy or ignorant, and likewise arguing from oh, that wasn't real socialism, that was just Tankies, makes you look ridiculous as you give the enemies of socialism ammunition against the whole movement in the propaganda war, which the left has far less resource-wise in fighting. You can disagree with the collectivization of agriculture in the USSR, for example, but that disagreement only means something when you understand the material conditions that gave rise to the necessity of that change in the first place. Likewise with...
Okay. Sure, and there's probably a lot of detail there that I'm missing. And again, maybe this isn't the right place for this. I would like to hear a roadmap of, maybe, where some of this decentralization could occur, why this might occur, and again, when it would occur. Did the Soviets have a roadmap for something like this? Do the, current Chinese Communist Party have a roadmap for something like this? And if not, I would ask why.
How it was carried out, how it progressed, what went wrong, and what could be changed in the future. You should be able to put forth alternatives. Same thing with the Great Leap Forward, or the failures of the many dozens of movements globally before even capturing power. Stalin and his consequences are important whether you like it or not, and without understanding what came before, we can't hope to be successful in future attempts. In essence, this is yet another attempt by me to encourage people to actually read boring, long, and intricate theoretical and scientific work so that we can actually have something novel to contribute in building a movement. Conclusion.
Someday.
If you don't understand a particular perspective, ask why. Dig into things. Simplistic answers are no answers at all, and there's always more nuance to be had. You're always free to disagree, and as Marxists we encourage that. But the truth of one particular tendency...
You're always free to disagree, and as Marxists, we encourage that. Again, I maybe it's the lib in me, trying to get out, but that feels a little contradictory with a lot of these regimes, where you can't ask those questions. You literally cannot ask those questions, right? Am I wrong in saying that? Because that's what I understand it to be. Let's run it back.
You're always free to disagree, and as Marxists, we encourage that.
You're always free to disagree. Again, I don't think that, oppression of dissent is any sort of requirement of socialism. I don't believe that. But it is a reality of many of these attempts at socialism. And maybe there are arguments to be made as to why. He didn't really make them in this video. But again, that might not be the place for it. That's fine. But this concept of, disagreement isn't something that you see in some of these regimes. Regimes that communists and tankies will defend to death. If I am mischaracterizing something, please let me know. I hope you understand that I am trying to engage in this in good faith, and I'm willing to admit there are huge gaps in my knowledge. So if I'm saying something off base, please let me know.
But the truth of one particular tendency does seem to annoyingly always present itself, at least in my experience. At this point, tanky is overused to the point that it becomes absolutely meaningless. Kinda like woke for conservatives, it's a catch-all term for things I don't like. For liberals, it's a lazy approach to political engagement. For those that consider themselves socialist, it's evidence of the ossification, lack of creativity, and lack of actually doing the fucking reading among the Western left, from which these ideas almost exclusively emanate from what I've seen. Much more important is the value of learning from former socialist experiments rather than simply dismissing them, as well as understanding the nuances which lead to the decisions they took. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be condemned when it's correct to do so, but likewise this condemnation needs an appropriate time, place, audience, and format for it to be meaningful if the person is acting in good faith. Otherwise it's vitriol, an attempt to shut down conversation, which doesn't help the movement, which interestingly enough is the motive of some.
Foolproof way to piss off Tankies. Just politely ask if Marxism-Leninism is just like social democracy with authoritarian characteristics. Will get you banned from their subreddits at lightning speeds. Yeah, I will say that about like these, communist subreddits. Any sort of dissent will get you immediately banned. Social democracy is when the government does stuff. I mean, that's more true than socialism is when the government does stuff. I guess so. Yeah, this is actually true, what he just said.
That use this term. This really is the issue. Go outside and actually contribute. If you see weirdos, avoid them. The internet isn't real life, and that's where most of this brain-dead discourse on both sides solely resides. Check out the podcast while you're at it. It's a fun ride, I promise. That's it for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.
I generally like this video. I do think there are places where I think he may have hand-waved certain things, and there are things that I think could have been expanded upon a little bit, that, maybe he would argue that this isn't the video for that. My audience knows these things more implicitly than you, liberal do. That's fine. So overall, I would say it's a good video. It touched on, many of the various ways people define tanky. So I do think I do have a more multifaceted view of how people use this term.